Grace Elliot did not see the man in the dark coat until his hand was already closing around her wrist. "You cannot go in there wearing that," he said. His voice was low, urgent, almost frightened. Grace pulled her arm free. "Excuse me?" "The dress. Take off the wrap and look at what you have on. Please, before you walk through those doors." She had borrowed the dress from her landlady 3 hours earlier, in a rush, after her own gown had ripped at the seam while she was getting out of the taxi. It was ivory silk, old-fashioned, a little too big at the shoulders. She had thought it looked elegant. She had not thought it looked dangerous. The stranger in the dark coat stepped back, as if the color itself might catch fire. Somewhere behind him, string music drifted out through the open doors of Ashcombe Hall, along with candlelight and laughter and the smell of wood smoke. Grace had come to this ball only because her employer, a small auction house that dealt in antique textiles, had 2 tickets and no one willing to use them. She was 29 years old, she catalogued lace patterns for a living, and she had exactly one rule for evenings like this: stay near the food, talk to no one important, leave before midnight. She was about to break that rule in a way she could not yet imagine. She thanked the stranger for his concern, decided he was drunk, or strange, or both, and walked through the doors of Ashcombe Hall. The room stopped. It did not stop slowly. It stopped the way a held breath stops, all at once, as though someone had pulled a plug from the bottom of the ocean and every wave in the room had frozen mid-crash. 300 guests in blue and gold and deep green turned toward her. A violin note bent and cracked. A waiter dropped a tray of glasses, and the sound of breaking crystal seemed to come from very far away. Grace looked down at herself, checking for a stain, a tear, anything that might explain 300 pairs of eyes locking onto her at once. She saw only the dress. Ivory. Simple. Nothing wrong with it at all. That was when a man crossed the floor toward her, faster than any man in formal shoes should be able to move, weaving between guests who parted for him like water around a stone. He was tall, dark-haired, dressed in black that made the room's gold and green look loud by comparison. His face was doing something complicated, something between shock and hope and a fear so old it looked inherited. He stopped in front of her. Up close, his eyes were the gray of a sky before rain, and they were fixed on her as though she were the only person left standing. "You came," he said. Grace blinked. "I'm sorry. I think you have me confused with the dress." His voice dropped, and for a moment it seemed to shake. "Do you know what it means? Here, in this house? It means I couldn't find my own gown in time, and my landlady is generous with her closet." Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of doubt, gone as fast as it appeared. Around them, whispers had already begun, rising like smoke through the crowd, drifting from guest to guest faster than Grace could track. She caught fragments. White, the old custom. Does she know? Look at the dowager's face. An elderly woman in deep burgundy silk was making her way toward them with the unhurried speed of someone who has never once in her life needed to run. Her hair was silver, pinned into a crown of braids, and her eyes, when they landed on Grace, held the sharp, assessing quality of a woman evaluating livestock at auction. "Alexander," the older woman said, not looking away from Grace. "Introduce us properly. Your future wife and I have not yet met." The floor seemed to tilt. "Grandmother." The word came out strangled. "This is a misunderstanding." "Is it?" The dowager's gaze moved over Grace's dress, slow and deliberate, cataloging every inch of ivory silk, the way Grace herself cataloged antique lace. "In this family, a woman does not wear white to the Ashcombe ball unless she means to accept a proposal that has not yet been spoken aloud. It has been true since before I was your age, Alexander, and it was true before your father's time, and his father's before him. 300 people just watched this young woman walk through that door in white, on the one night when white means something. Explain to me how that is a misunderstanding, and explain it quickly, because I can already see the Baroness reaching for her telephone." Grace's mouth had gone dry. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear to you, I did not know." "That," said the dowager, is the only detail in this entire situation that concerns me. Not whether you know, whether they believe you know." She tilted her head toward the crowd, where phones were already rising, screens glowing like small, dishonest moons. Alexander stepped closer to Grace, close enough that she could smell cedar and something like rain on stone. "Listen to me," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear. "Whatever happens in the next 30 seconds, do not run. Running will make it worse. Running is what guilty people do, and you have done nothing. What do I do instead? Let me handle it." He turned to face the room, drew a breath, and lifted his voice so that it carried to the far corners of the hall, over the string quartet, over the whispers, over the sound of 100 cameras being lifted at once. "This is Miss Grace Elliot," he announced. "She is my guest tonight, and I asked her, personally, to wear white." The lie landed in the room like a stone, dropped into still water. Grace felt it ripple outward, felt every eye recalculate, felt the temperature of the whispers shift from scandal to something closer to romance. The dowager's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. It was the only sign she gave that she knew exactly what her grandson had just done, and exactly what it would cost him. Grace turned to Alexander, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you say that?" "Because the alternative," he said, "was watching you get torn apart by people who have never once in their lives had to work for anything, including their opinions. I would rather they tear into me." "You don't even know me." "No," he agreed. "I don't." He held out his arm, the way a man offers a lifeline, not a courtesy. "But in about 10 seconds, my grandmother is going to ask you to dance with me, in front of everyone, so that the story settles before the gossip writers finish their first drink. If you would rather leave, there is a side door behind the orchestra, and I will create enough noise to cover you reaching it. If you would rather stay, take my arm, and we will get through the next hour together." Grace looked toward the side door. It was close. It was clean. It was the smart, careful, catalog your lace and go home choice. Then she looked at the crowd, at the phones, at the dowager's razor-sharp attention, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever she chose in the next 5 seconds would follow her long after tonight ended. And the music began again, hesitant at first, then fuller, and Alexander led her onto the floor, as though nothing at all was wrong, as though 300 people were not watching every step, as though a single mistaken dress had not just rewritten both their lives in front of witnesses. "You're shaking," he said quietly as they turned. "I catalog antique lace for a living," Grace said. "Nobody has ever watched me do anything before tonight." "They're not watching you," he said. "They're watching a story. Give them a few more minutes of it, and they'll go back to their champagne. And after the few minutes," his jaw tightened, just slightly, "after that, we have a much longer conversation. But not here." Across the room, a young man in a sharp gray suit had gone very still, his glass of wine forgotten in his hand. His name was Edmund Ashcombe, cousin to Alexander, and the expression on his face was not shock, and it was not delight. It was calculation. He watched Grace and Alexander turn together beneath the chandeliers, watched the dowager's satisfied stillness, watched 300 witnesses fall in love with a story that had not, until tonight, existed at all. Then he set down his glass, and he began, very quietly, to make a phone call. Grace did not notice him. She was too busy trying to remember how to breathe evenly, while an entire ballroom decided, without asking her, that her life had just changed forever. The dance ended. The applause that followed was polite, tentative, uncertain of its own enthusiasm, but it was applause, and it meant the crowd had chosen, for now, to believe the story they had been handed. Alexander led her off the floor and through a side hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, each one seeming to watch her pass with quiet, oil-painted judgment. "We need to talk," he said, once they were alone, "properly, away from all of this." "I have a job," Grace said. "I have an apartment with a broken radiator and a landlady who is going to want her dress back eventually." I don't belong in a story like this. I know. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, and for the first time since the ballroom, he looked less like a duke and more like an exhausted man in his early 30s who had just watched his life detonate in front of an audience. I need you to stay for 1 week, just one, long enough for the story to lose its heat. After that, you can go back to your lace and your radiator and never think about this house again. And if I say no, then the story doesn't die, he said. It grows. Reporters will find your workplace by tomorrow morning. They will find your landlady, your family, your childhood photographs. A denial now looks like a scandal. A quiet week here looks like the truth settling. I am not asking you to marry me, Miss Elliot. I am asking you to survive the next 7 days with me, so that neither of us has to survive the next 7 years explaining ourselves. Grace looked past him, down the hallway of painted ancestors, toward the ballroom where laughter and music continued as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Somewhere out there, Edmund Ashcombe was still on his phone, speaking in a voice too quiet for anyone to hear, arranging something that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with a will that named an heir only if that heir married within the year. Grace did not know this yet. She only knew that the exit was behind her, the ballroom was ahead of her, and a stranger with rain-gray eyes was waiting for an answer she had not expected to be asked to give. 1 week, she said finally, not 1 day more. Something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly, as though he had been holding a weight he had not expected her to help carry. 1 week, he agreed. Neither of them noticed the side door at the end of the hallway open a crack, or the shadow that slipped through it and disappeared into the night, carrying news towards someone who was very interested in making sure this particular week ended badly. The car that arrived to take Grace back to collect her things was black, long, and far too polished for the kind of neighborhood she lived in. She sat in the back seat, still wearing the ivory dress, watching city lights slide past the window, and tried to convince herself that tomorrow morning she would wake up and discover this had been an unusually vivid dream. It was not a dream. By the time the car reached her apartment building, a small crowd had already gathered outside, drawn by a single leaked photograph from the ball, her face turned toward Alexander Ashcombe beneath golden light, captioned with a question mark and 300,000 shares. Grace stared at the crowd through the tinted window, at the flashing phone screens, at strangers already shouting her name as though they had known her for years. They found me already, she said quietly. The driver, an older man with kind eyes and no comment to offer, simply nodded. The Duke said this might happen. There's a back entrance. He asked me to bring you round that way. Grace pressed her palm flat against the cool glass of the window, watching the crowd grow larger by the second, and understood, for the first time, exactly how far outside her ordinary life she had just stepped. 1 week, she told herself. 1 week, and then I go home. She did not yet know how wrong that promise would turn out to be. The back entrance of the apartment building smelled of old paint and cold stone, and Grace stood in it for a long moment before she could make herself climb the stairs. Her hands would not stop trembling. She blamed the cold. She knew it was not the cold. Her landlady, a sharp-tongued woman named Wren Doyle who had lived in that building longer than Grace had been alive, opened the door before Grace could knock, phone already in hand, screen glowing with the same photograph that was now circling the world. You, Wren said, are going to explain every single detail of this to me, and you are going to do it while I make tea, because I am not equipped to hear this story standing up. Grace told her everything, sitting at a kitchen table that wobbled on one short leg, while Wren's tea went cold between them, forgotten. She told her about the taxi, the torn seam, the borrowed dress, the man in the dark coat who had tried to warn her, the room falling silent, the dowager's ice-edged voice, the lie Alexander Ashcombe had told 300 strangers to protect her. He lied for you, Wren said slowly, in front of his entire family, his grandmother, and what sounds like half the aristocracy of this country. He lied so I wouldn't be destroyed by gossip, Grace said. That's different from lying for me. Is it? Ren studied her over the rim of her cup. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds exactly the same. Grace did not answer that. She could not, because some small, unhelpful part of her had already begun turning the memory of the dance over and over. The warmth of his hand at her waist, the low urgency in his voice when he asked her to trust him, and she did not like how much she wanted to examine that memory more closely. She packed a bag with the efficiency of someone trying not to think too hard about what she was packing for. 3 days of clothes. Her tablet, so she could keep working remotely. A photograph of her mother, who had died 4 years earlier and would have found this entire situation either hilarious or horrifying. Grace could never decide which. By the time the car pulled away from the curb, the crowd outside had grown to nearly 50 people, phones raised like torches, voices calling questions Grace did not answer. She kept her eyes forward and her hands folded tightly in her lap until the car turned a corner and the noise fell away behind them. Ashcombe Hall at night was a different creature entirely from the glittering, music-filled version she had walked into hours earlier. Now it stood dark and enormous against a sky heavy with clouds, its windows glowing here and there like watchful eyes, its long gravel drive stretching out ahead of the car like the throat of something very old and very patient. Alexander was waiting on the front steps when the car arrived, no longer in his formal black, wearing instead a simple dark sweater that made him look younger, less like a duke, and more like a man who had not slept properly in some time. "You came back," he said, as though he had genuinely doubted it. "I said 1 week." "You did." He studied her for a moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Come inside. My grandmother wants to speak with you before the household settles for the night, and I would rather you hear her plans directly from her than have them arrive as rumor." The dowager received them in a small sitting room lined with books, a fire crackling in the hearth despite the mild evening, as though the room itself required warmth on principle rather than necessity. She simply gestured toward the chair across from her, the way a queen might gesture toward a subject. "Sit, Miss Elliot." Grace sat. "I am going to speak plainly," the dowager said, "because I find plain speech saves everyone a great deal of wasted time. My grandson made a public claim tonight, in front of 300 witnesses and, I am reliably informed, at least 2 members of the press who were not meant to be inside that ballroom at all. That claim cannot simply be withdrawn tomorrow morning. If it is, the story becomes that Alexander lied to protect a woman he barely knows, which raises uncomfortable questions about why he felt the need to lie at all. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "I think so," Grace said carefully. "You're telling me the story has to hold together for longer than 1 night." "I am telling you," the dowager said, "that you have 1 week to convince a great many people, most of whom you will never meet, that nothing strange has happened here at all. During that week, you will attend certain events with my grandson. You will be seen. You will be photographed whether you like it or not, and I would strongly suggest you learn to like it, because resentment shows on a person's face far more clearly than they think it does." Grace glanced at Alexander, who was watching the fire rather than meeting her eyes, his jaw tight. "And after the week?" Grace asked. "After the week," the dowager said, "you will leave quietly. The story will fade the way all stories eventually fade, and my grandson will be, once again, a very eligible and very unmarried duke, free to disappoint me in his own time, rather than in front of an audience." There was something underneath the dowager's brisk, business-like tone, something that sounded almost like grief, though Grace could not have said grief for what. She filed the observation away without understanding it yet. "There is one more matter," the dowager continued, "which you should know before you commit to this arrangement. My late husband's will contains a clause regarding this estate and its inheritance. Alexander must be married, or formally engaged, before his 34th birthday, or the estate passes to another branch of the family. That birthday is 6 weeks from today." Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. 6 weeks. 6 weeks, the dowager repeated, "which means the timing of your accidental white dress, Miss Elliot, could not have been more convenient for my grandson, or more suspicious to anyone who wishes to look closely at the situation. I trust you understand why I need this week to go smoothly." Grace turned to Alexander. "You didn't tell me about the will." "I didn't think it was relevant," he said. "You're leaving in a week. The will is my problem, not yours." "It's relevant if people think I'm part of a plan to save your inheritance," Grace said, her voice sharper than she intended. "That's not a small detail. That's the whole shape of the story." Alexander finally looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression, something that had nothing to do with dukes or wills or ballrooms. "I know," he said quietly. "I know exactly how it looks. I have spent the last 4 hours trying to think of a version of tonight that doesn't look like exactly what my grandmother just described, and I have not found one. I am asking you to trust me anyway, because the alternative is worse for both of us." The fire popped softly in the grate. Somewhere in the great dark house, a clock struck the hour, slow and deep, and Grace felt the sound settle into her bones like a warning she could not yet name. "I'll stay the week," she said finally, "but I want the truth from now on. All of it. No more surprises like the will." "Agreed," Alexander said. The dowager rose, smoothing her burgundy skirts, satisfied enough with the arrangement to consider the conversation finished. "Good. Then I suggest everyone sleep. Tomorrow, Miss Elliot, my staff will help you settle into the East Wing, and Alexander will show you the grounds, so that if anyone asks, you can describe them convincingly." She left the room without another word, her footsteps fading down the long corridor, and for a moment, Grace and Alexander stood alone by the dying fire, the weight of everything unsaid pressing into the silence between them. "Your grandmother is terrifying," Grace said finally. "She built this family's reputation with her bare hands after my grandfather nearly ruined it," Alexander said. "Terrifying is generally how you survive that kind of work." Grace studied him for a moment, this stranger who had crossed a crowded room to protect her, who had lied in front of hundreds to save her from ridicule, who was now 6 weeks from losing everything his family had built if he did not marry a woman he barely knew. "Why me?" she asked. "Out of everyone in that room, why did you come to me?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though the answer was written somewhere in the coals. "Because when I saw you standing in that doorway," he said finally, "you looked exactly as confused and terrified as I felt the moment my father told me about the will. I recognized it. I didn't decide to help you because of the dress, Miss Elliot. I decided because of your face." He left the room before she could answer, and Grace sat alone by the fire for a long time afterward, turning his words over and over, trying and failing to find the version of this story that made sense, and finding instead a strange, unwelcome warmth spreading slowly through her chest. The East Wing, when the housekeeper finally showed her to it, was quiet and grand and lonelier than any place Grace had ever slept. She lay awake long after midnight, listening to the old house settle and creak around her, and did not notice the pale strip of light beneath a door 2 floors below, where Edmund Ashcombe sat awake at a desk, sorting through old family documents with the careful, patient attention of a man building a case. He had already made 3 phone calls that night. He would make several more before morning. None of them were friendly. By the time Grace finally fell asleep, the first gray light of dawn was already beginning to touch the tall windows of Ashcombe Hall, and somewhere out past the gates, a photographer, with a very long lens, sat parked on the shoulder of the road, waiting patiently for the sun to rise high enough to see clearly through the trees. The week had not even properly begun, and already, quietly, in ways neither Grace nor Alexander yet understood, it had started to become something far more dangerous than either of them expected. Grace woke to the sound of a car engine failing to start. It was a strange thing to wake to, out here in the countryside, far from any street, and for a moment she lay in the unfamiliar bed trying to place the sound before her mind caught up with where she was. Ashcombe Hall, the East Wing, 6 weeks until a will decided a man's future, and 1 week until she was supposed to disappear quietly from it. She dressed quickly, choosing a plain gray sweater and jeans from her own suitcase, determined that at least one part of her day would not be dictated by anyone else's rules about color. Downstairs, The kitchen was already busy, staff moving in the practiced, silent choreography of people who had worked in a great house for years. A woman with flour on her hands and kindness in her eyes introduced herself as Nora, the head cook, and set a plate of eggs and toast in front of Grace, without being asked, the way people do when they have decided, on sight, that someone needs feeding and comforting in equal measure. "You're the one from the ball," Nora said. It was not a question. "I am." "Don't mind the staff talk," Nora said, wiping her hands on her apron. "This house has seen stranger things than an accidental dress. Eat your breakfast." Grace ate, grateful for the plain kindness of it, and had nearly finished when Alexander appeared in the doorway, dressed for outdoors, a look on his face that suggested he had already had a difficult morning and it was not yet 9 o'clock. "There's a problem with one of the estate vehicles," he said. "My cousin was trying to take the old truck out to the eastern fields, and the brakes failed on the drive. He's fine. Shaken, but fine. The truck went into a hedge instead of down the slope, which is the only reason I'm telling you this calmly instead of from a hospital corridor." "That's terrifying," Grace said. "It's old machinery," Alexander said, though something in his voice did not sound entirely convinced by his own explanation. "These things happen on an estate this size. I only mention it because it means our morning walk is delayed. I need to see to Edmund first." Grace nearly missed it, the flicker of tension around Alexander's eyes at the mention of his cousin's name, gone before she could examine it properly. "Edmund," she repeated. "Is that the man in the gray suit from last night? By the wine table?" "That's him." Alexander's jaw tightened. "He didn't come over to be introduced. I noticed that too. Should I be worried about that?" "You should be aware of it," Alexander said carefully. "Whether you should be worried is a separate question I haven't finished answering for myself yet." He left to check on his cousin, and Grace spent the next hour wandering the gardens alone, trying to settle the uneasy feeling that had taken root in her chest since the mention of failed brakes. She told herself it was nothing. Old trucks on old estates broke down constantly. She was imagining significance where there was none, the way people did after a stressful, sleepless night. She was still telling herself this when she rounded a hedge and nearly collided directly with Edmund Ashcombe himself. He was younger than Alexander by perhaps 5 years, sharper featured, dressed even now, mid-morning, in country tweeds pressed to a precision that seemed almost aggressive. His eyes moved over Grace with the same cataloging coldness she had felt from the Dowager the night before, though where the Dowager's assessment had felt protective, Edmund's felt like something closer to threat. "Miss Elliot," he said, "the accidental fiancé. That's not a phrase I've heard yet, but I suppose it fits. It will be in every paper by tomorrow." He said it lightly, almost pleasantly, the way a man discusses weather he does not particularly care about. "You should know, before you get too comfortable in that dress and this house, that Alexander does not need saving nearly as much as he'd like you to believe. He needs a wife by his birthday, or this entire estate, all of it, passes to my branch of the family. 6 weeks from now, Miss Elliot, either you're standing beside him at an altar, or I am standing where he currently stands. Those are, as far as I can tell, the only 2 outcomes available." Grace kept her voice level, though her pulse had picked up considerably. "That sounds like something you should discuss with your cousin, not with me." "I have discussed it with my cousin," Edmund said. "For several years, in fact, long before you fell through that door in the wrong dress. He has never once, in all that time, shown the slightest interest in marrying anyone. And then, remarkably, 6 weeks before the deadline that determines whether I inherit an estate my grandfather always intended for me, a woman he has never met walks in wearing white, and he suddenly discovers a great deal of interest in marriage. You think this is staged?" "I think," Edmund said, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes at all, "that a truck's brakes do not simply fail on their own, and a dowager does not simply believe a story so convenient it might as well have been written for her, and a duke does not simply fall for a stranger in the space of one dance, unless something is being managed very carefully behind the scenes. I don't yet know if you're part of that management, Miss Elliot, or merely a very lucky accident. I intend to find out, and when I do, I will make certain everyone in that ballroom and everyone reading about it in the papers finds out along with me." He walked past her without waiting for a response, leaving Grace standing alone in the garden, cold despite the mild morning sun, turning his words over with a growing, uneasy dread. A truck's brakes do not simply fail on their own. She found Alexander an hour later in the stable yard, examining the damaged vehicle with a mechanic who was shaking his head slowly over the exposed underside of the truck. Grace waited until the mechanic stepped away before approaching. "I met your cousin," she said. Alexander's expression darkened immediately. "What did he say to you?" "He thinks this is staged. He thinks the accident with the truck might not have been an accident. He as good as told me he intends to prove it, one way or another." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the truck's undercarriage as though it might offer him a more honest answer than his cousin had. "The mechanic says the brake line was cut," he said finally, very quietly. "Not worn through. Cut." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her, the polite, strange, dreamlike quality of the last 24 hours suddenly cracking open into something far more serious. "Cut by who?" "I don't know," Alexander said. "But Edmund was driving that truck, and if the brakes were meant to fail on that particular slope, at that particular speed, someone either wanted to frighten him, or someone made a very serious mistake about which vehicle they were sabotaging. You think someone might have meant it for you?" Alexander did not answer immediately, and his silence answered for him. "There is a groundsman," he said finally, "who has worked for this family for 11 years, who I trust completely, and who tells me that truck was used almost exclusively by whoever drove out to the eastern fields that morning. I was originally meant to make that drive myself, to check on a fence line the tenants reported down. Edmund only took the truck because I asked him to go in my place, so that I could deal with the situation from last night instead." The words settled between them, heavy and cold. "Someone tried to hurt you," Grace said slowly, "and hurt your cousin by accident instead." "I don't know that for certain," Alexander said, though the tightness in his voice suggested he believed it more than he wanted to. "What I do know is that 6 weeks from now, a great deal of money and land changes hands one way or another, and apparently that is enough motivation for someone in this house to consider cutting a brake line rather than simply waiting to see how the will plays out honestly." Grace thought of Edmund's cold, calculating eyes in the garden, his careful insistence that she was either a co-conspirator or a convenient accident, his promise to expose whichever one was true. "Do you think it was him?" she asked. "Do you think Edmund cut his own brakes to make it look like someone else did it?" "I don't know," Alexander said again, and this time his frustration showed plainly. "I have known my cousin his entire life. I would have said, before yesterday, that he was ambitious and occasionally bitter about an inheritance he was raised to believe should have been his, but not dangerous. Now I am no longer certain what to believe about anyone in this house, including, forgive me, you." The words landed like a slap, and Grace took a step back before she could stop herself. "I understand why you'd think that," she said, keeping her voice steady with considerable effort. "I would probably think the same thing in your position, but I want to be very clear with you, Alexander. I did not choose this. I did not plan this. I borrowed a dress from my landlady because my own gown tore in a taxi, and every single thing that has happened since then has happened to me, not because of me." Something in his face softened, guilt replacing suspicion. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I'm not thinking clearly. Someone tried to hurt someone in my family this morning, and I don't know who, and I don't know why, beyond the obvious, and it is making me doubt things I shouldn't doubt." "Then let's find out who," Grace said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "Together. Because if someone is willing to cut a brake line over an inheritance, Alexander, then whatever happens between us in the next 6 weeks, real or staged, matters a great deal less than making sure nobody else gets hurt while we figure this out." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his rain-gray eyes, gratitude and fear, and something else entirely tangled together. "Thank you," he said simply. They spent the rest of that day together, quietly, methodically, walking the grounds and speaking with staff, trying to reconstruct who might have had access to the truck the previous evening, who knew Alexander's original plan to drive it himself, and who stood to gain most from an accident that never quite finished happening. The list, uncomfortably, was short. It included Edmund. It included 2 staff members with long-standing grievances about wages the estate had frozen years earlier during a difficult season. And it included, though neither of them said it aloud, the dowager herself, who had more reason than anyone in the house to want this marriage settled quickly and permanently, and who had shown, in one conversation the night before, exactly how far she was willing to bend the truth to protect the family's future. Grace did not believe the elderly woman capable of sabotaging a vehicle, but she noted, with the same careful attention she gave to identifying centuries-old lace patterns, that everyone in this house had a motive of some kind, and that motive, however small, was worth remembering. That evening, as the sun sank low and gold over the eastern fields, Grace found herself standing beside Alexander at the edge of the property, looking out over land that had belonged to his family for generations, land that might, in 6 weeks, belong to someone else entirely. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always. If none of this had happened, no brake line, no will, no ball, no dress, if you'd simply met me somewhere ordinary, a coffee shop, a train platform, would you have looked twice?" Alexander considered the question with the same careful honesty he seemed to bring to everything. "I don't know," he admitted. "I like to think so, but I've spent so long being introduced to women my family approves of, at events designed for exactly that purpose, that I'm not certain I would have recognized what I was looking at, if it arrived any other way than falling through a door in the wrong color dress, looking as terrified as I felt." "That's not exactly a compliment." "No," he agreed, a small, tired smile breaking through for the first time all day. "But it might be the truest thing I've said to you since you arrived." The wind moved through the fields, carrying with it the smell of cut grass and coming rain, and for a moment, standing there at the edge of everything that could go wrong, Grace allowed herself to simply stand beside him and feel the strange, unearned comfort of his presence, before the weight of everything else came rushing back in. Somewhere behind them, in a study lit by a single desk lamp, Edmund Ashcombe sat reviewing old documents with a lawyer he had hired quietly, 3 days earlier, long before any dress or any ball had happened at all. On the desk in front of him sat a folder labeled with Alexander's name, and inside it a photograph, taken through a long lens, of Alexander and Grace, standing together at the edge of the eastern fields, close enough to matter. Edmund studied the photograph for a long moment. Then he made another phone call. This one, unlike the others, was not about brake lines or trucks or accidents that might or might not have been meant for someone else. This one was about timing, about a plan already 3 days old, about making absolutely certain that whatever happened over the next 6 weeks, the estate ended up exactly where he believed it had always belonged. Grace and Alexander walked back toward the house as the last light faded from the sky, unaware that the danger circling them had not ended with a damaged truck in a hedge, but was only, patiently, quietly, just beginning. By the 4th day, the household had settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm, one part fairy tale, one part siege. Photographers camped along the public road beyond the gates from dawn until well past dark. Staff members spoke in lowered voices when Grace passed, not out of unkindness, she came to understand, but out of a genuine uncertainty about how much they were permitted to know. Grace had begun helping the estate's archivist, an elderly, soft-spoken man named Percy, catalog a collection of old family letters that had never been properly organized. It gave her hands something honest to do, and it gave her, unexpectedly, a window into the Ashcombe family that neither the Dowager nor Alexander had offered her directly. It was among these letters, tucked into a bundle from nearly 40 years earlier, that she found the first thread that would eventually unravel everything. The letter was written in a woman's careful, looping hand, addressed to a man named William Ashcombe, Alexander's grandfather. It spoke of a broken engagement, a scandal quietly buried, and a settlement paid to ensure a certain family line would never again have legal claim to the estate. The woman's name was Eleanor Vance. The letter was dated 4 months before William Ashcombe married the woman who would become the dowager. Grace sat very still, reading it twice, then a third time, before carrying it carefully to Percy. "Do you know anything about this?" she asked. "About a woman named Eleanor Vance?" Percy's kind face grew unusually still. "That is a very old story, Miss Elliot, and one I was asked, many years ago, never to discuss." "Asked by who?" "By the dowager herself," Percy said quietly. "Before you press further, I would strongly suggest you speak with her directly, rather than with an old man who values his position in this house." Grace found the dowager that evening in the same book-lined sitting room where they had first spoken, and laid the letter gently on the table between them. The dowager looked at it for a long time without touching it. "Where did you find this?" "In the archive. I wasn't looking for anything specific. It was simply there." The dowager was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes uncharacteristically distant. "Eleanor Vance was engaged to my husband before I ever met him," she said finally. "She came from a family with a rival claim to a portion of this land, dating back nearly a century before either of us was born. When the engagement ended, badly and rather publicly, a settlement was arranged to ensure her family relinquished any future claim. I did not know the full details of that settlement until years after I married William myself." "Why does this matter now?" The dowager's mouth tightened. "Because Eleanor Vance's family line did not disappear, Miss Elliot. It continued, quietly, at a distance from this estate, until, some 30 years later, one of her descendants married into this family after all, through a side branch nobody thought significant at the time." Grace felt something cold settle over her. "Edmund's mother." "Edmund's mother," the dowager confirmed, "which means my grandson's cousin is not simply a distant relative disappointed about an inheritance he was raised to believe should have been his. He is the descendant of a woman my husband abandoned, carrying a grievance that predates any of us by 2 full generations, and a legal claim to this land that some old lawyers, in quieter decades, believed might still hold water in a modern court, if pressed correctly. You think Edmund knows this?" "I think," the dowager said carefully, "that Edmund has spent a great deal of time and money on lawyers in the past several months, and I think it is no longer a coincidence that a truck's brake line failed on the very morning my grandson was originally meant to drive it himself." Grace's mind raced back through everything Edmund had said to her in the garden, his cold certainty, his careful threat to expose whatever truth lay beneath her sudden engagement, and understood, with sudden and unwelcome clarity, that his interest in proving the engagement staged was never really about the engagement at all. It was about removing Alexander from the picture entirely, by whatever means necessary, before the will's deadline arrived and the estate's future was legally settled. She found Alexander in his study late that night, papers spread across his desk, dark circles beneath his eyes from too many sleepless nights spent trying to solve a puzzle that kept revealing new, more dangerous pieces. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to listen, without deciding yet what it means." She told him everything: the letter, Eleanor Vance, the old legal claim, his grandmother's quiet confirmation of a grievance 2 generations deep. Alexander listened in silence, his expression darkening with every new detail, until finally he sat back in his chair and pressed both hands over his face. "He's not trying to inherit fairly," Alexander said finally, his voice low and rough. "He's trying to remove the competition." "I think that's exactly what he's trying to do." The brake line. Alexander's hands dropped from his face, his eyes hard now, fear giving way to something colder and more focused. "That wasn't a warning, Grace. That was an attempt. We don't know that for certain, don't we?" Alexander stood, pacing the length of the study, restless energy replacing exhaustion. A man with a 2-generation grievance and a legal claim he believes might hold up in court, 6 weeks before a deadline that determines everything, and a truck with a cut brake line that he happened to be driving, in place of me, on a route I was originally meant to take. What version of that story doesn't end with someone getting hurt, Grace? The version where we tell someone, Grace said firmly. Not quietly, not carefully managed the way your grandmother manages everything else. The police, Alexander, tonight. He stopped pacing, looking at her as though the suggestion had genuinely not occurred to him. My family does not typically bring outside authority into matters like this. Your family typically survives matters like this by managing appearances, Grace said. I understand why that instinct exists. I've watched it work for 4 days now, but someone cut a brake line on a vehicle that was meant to kill or seriously injure a member of this family, and the next attempt might not fail as luckily as this one did. This isn't a matter of appearances anymore, Alexander. This is a matter of someone's life. He was quiet for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, and Grace understood she was watching a man raised his entire life to protect his family's reputation above almost everything else, finally choosing, deliberately, to protect something more important instead. You're right, he said finally. I'll call in the morning. Why not now? Because, Alexander said, and for the first time in 4 days, real fear showed plainly on his face. If Edmund realizes tonight that we know, before the police arrive to speak with him properly, I don't know what he'll do next, and I would rather have officers here before he has time to react. They agreed to wait until dawn, both of them too unsettled to sleep, and spent the remaining hours of the night in the study together, going over every detail again and again, searching for anything they might have missed. It was near 3 in the morning, the house utterly silent around them, when Grace heard the sound. A door, somewhere below them, opening slowly. Alexander heard it too. He went still, one hand raised, silencing whatever she had been about to say. Footsteps, careful, deliberate, moving toward the east wing, toward the very rooms where Grace had been sleeping for 4 nights. Stay here, Alexander whispered. Absolutely not. There was no time to argue further. He moved toward the study door, and Grace followed close behind him, both of them moving through the dark, familiar shape of the house with the particular quiet of people who understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever was happening below them could not wait for daylight. They reached the top of the east wing staircase just in time to see a shadow slip through the door of Grace's room, the same room where, an hour earlier, she had left her tablet, her notes, and copies of the letter about Eleanor Vance sitting openly on the desk. Alexander lunged forward, flipping on the hallway light, and the shadow spun to face them. It was Edmund. He stood frozen in the doorway of Grace's room, the letter about Eleanor Vance clutched in one hand, his expression caught somewhere between fury and something that looked almost like desperation. Put it down, Alexander said, his voice dangerously quiet. You have no right to this, Edmund said, and for the first time, his careful, cold composure cracked entirely. That land was my family's before it was ever yours. My grandmother was cast aside, humiliated, paid to disappear, and your grandfather married the woman who replaced her without a second thought for what he'd destroyed. I am not stealing anything, Alexander. I am reclaiming what should have been mine 2 generations ago. By cutting a brake line, Alexander's voice shook now, fury finally breaking through his careful control. By nearly killing yourself, or nearly killing me, over a grievance that isn't even yours to carry. Something in Edmund's face went very still. I didn't cut any brake line, he said slowly. The mechanic found the cut, this morning, on the truck you drove. For a long moment, nobody in the hallway moved. Grace watched Edmund's expression shift, confusion replacing fury, genuine fear beginning to surface beneath it. I didn't do that, Edmund said again, quieter now, and something in his voice, some quality of real shock rather than performance, made Grace's stomach turn cold. If Edmund was telling the truth, someone else in Ashcombe Hall had cut that brake line. someone who had let Edmund carry the blame quietly in the background while they continued moving, unnoticed, toward whatever they actually intended. And that person, whoever they were, was still inside the house. Alexander called the police at first light, exactly as he had promised, and by mid-morning 2 officers were seated in the same book-lined sitting room where Grace had first learned about the will, taking careful notes while Edmund, pale and shaken but no longer hostile, explained everything he knew. He explained the lawyers he had hired, the old claim through his grandmother's line, the months spent quietly building a case he had hoped to bring forward through proper legal channels rather than sabotage. He explained, with a bitterness that had clearly been building for years, how his mother had raised him on stories of the humiliation done to her mother, and how he had let that bitterness curdle, slowly, into suspicion of his own cousin. But he insisted, again and again, that he had never touched the truck. "I have a great many faults," Edmund said quietly, staring at his hands. "I resent this family for things that happened before I was born. I have spent money I probably shouldn't have on lawyers, chasing a claim that likely wouldn't have held up in any modern court anyway. But I would not risk my own life, or my cousin's, over land. Whatever you believe about me, please believe that." One of the officers, a steady, unhurried woman named Detective Marsh, asked a question that made the room go very still. Who else knew the truck was going out that morning? And who else knew the original route was meant for the Duke himself? The answer, when they traced it carefully back through the household, narrowed to a very small list. Alexander, Edmund, the groundsman who had reported the fence line, and one other name, mentioned almost in passing by the mechanic, who recalled the estate's longtime land steward stopping by the garage the previous evening to check the truck's fuel level before the morning drive. His name was Callum Hargrove. He had managed the estate's finances and land dealings for nearly 15 years, trusted so completely by 3 generations of Ashcombs that his name rarely appeared in any conversation about the family's inner circle, precisely because he had always seemed like part of the furniture rather than a person capable of ambition or grievance of his own. Detective Marsh found him within the hour, in his office at the edge of the property, papers already half-packed into a briefcase, a train ticket for that afternoon tucked visibly into his jacket pocket. It took very little pressure for the full story to come apart in his hands. For nearly 3 years, Hargrove had been quietly diverting portions of the estate's land revenue into private accounts, funding a lifestyle far beyond what his official salary could explain. He had planned, for months, to finalize a private sale of a large portion of the estate's northern acreage to a development company, a sale that would have gone through quietly, under confused, transitional circumstances, had the inheritance passed to Edmund instead of Alexander. Edmund, less experienced in estate management and less attentive to land dealings than his cousin, would have been far easier for Hargrove to mislead into approving the sale before realizing its true value, or the missing money buried beneath it. Alexander's sudden engagement, appearing from nowhere 6 weeks before the deadline, had threatened to derail that plan entirely. If Alexander married and secured the inheritance cleanly, an audit of the estate's finances would almost certainly follow as part of the transition, an audit Hargrove could not survive. He had cut the brake line the night before the Eastern Fields drive, intending, he confessed with his head bowed low, only to delay Alexander long enough to buy himself a few more weeks to finalize the sale and disappear before anything could be traced back to him. He had not known, when he cut the line, that Alexander would ask Edmund to take the drive in his place instead. "I never meant for anyone to be hurt," Hargrove said quietly, and whatever truth existed in that claim, it did nothing to soften the horror of how close the truck had come to the edge of that slope, or how differently that morning might have ended. By evening, Hargrove was in police custody, the northern acreage sale exposed and halted, and Ashcombe Hall settled into a strange, shaken quiet, the kind that follows very closely after real danger has finally passed. Edmund found Grace alone in the garden that evening, the same spot where he had first threatened to expose her. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I spent 4 days convinced you were part of some scheme against my family, when the actual scheme was happening in the estate office the entire time, run by a man I trusted more than anyone in this house. "You don't owe me an apology," Grace said. "You owe yourself a little grace. You were protecting something you believed had been stolen from your family a long time ago. That's not the same thing as being a danger to it." Edmund studied her for a moment, something like genuine respect crossing his face for the first time since they had met. "Whatever this arrangement between you and my cousin actually is," he said, "I hope, for both your sakes, that by the time this week ends, it's stopped being an arrangement at all." He left her alone with that thought, and Grace stood for a long time in the fading light, turning his words over, and finding, somewhere beneath the exhaustion of the last few days, a quiet and unexpected hope she had not let herself feel until now. The remaining days of that week passed differently than the frightened, uncertain ones before them. With Hargrove's betrayal exposed, and the estate's finances finally being properly investigated, a strange lightness settled over Ashcombe Hall, as though the entire house had been holding its breath for years without realizing it, and had only just now been allowed to exhale. Grace and Alexander spent those days together in ways that had nothing to do with managing appearances for reporters or convincing a suspicious cousin of anything. They walked the grounds simply because the grounds were beautiful, and because walking beside each other had become, somewhere in the middle of danger and confession, a thing they both quietly looked forward to. They talked long into the evenings, about ordinary things, her work with antique lace, his complicated love for a house that had nearly cost him everything, and slowly, carefully, about the parts of themselves that neither had planned on revealing to a stranger they had met by accident. On the sixth night, the two of them stood again at the edge of the eastern fields, the same spot where Alexander had once admitted he might not have recognized her if she had arrived any other way than falling through a door in the wrong dress. "Tomorrow is the last day," Grace said quietly. "The week we agreed to. I know. Your grandmother said I could leave quietly after that. Go back to my apartment, my lace, my landlady's opinions." "You could," Alexander agreed, his voice careful, deliberate, the voice of a man choosing every word before he let himself say it. "I would understand completely if that's what you wanted." Grace turned to face him fully, the wind moving gently through the fields around them, carrying the same smell of coming rain that had surrounded them the first time they stood in this exact spot together. "And if it isn't what I want?" Something shifted in Alexander's expression, hope breaking carefully through months, maybe years, of careful restraint. "Then I would ask you to stay," he said, "not because of a will or a deadline or a dress worn by mistake. I would ask you to stay because somewhere in the middle of nearly losing everything this week, I realized the only part of it I actually cared about protecting was you." Grace felt something loosen in her chest, some careful, guarded thing she had been holding on to since the moment she first walked through those ballroom doors, confused and terrified and utterly unprepared for the life that was about to fall into her lap. "I catalog antique lace for a living," she said softly. "I have a broken radiator, and a landlady who is going to want her dress back eventually, and I have absolutely no idea how to be a duchess." "I don't need a duchess," Alexander said. "I need someone who looks at a room full of people, deciding who she should be, and decides for herself instead. I've watched you do that all week." The final ball of the season took place 7 days later, once the last of the reporters had grown bored of the story and moved on to some fresher scandal, once Hargrove's case had been quietly handed over to the courts, and once Edmund, in an unexpected turn nobody could have predicted a fortnight earlier, had accepted Alexander's offer to properly formalize his own stake in a portion of the estate's income, a settlement built not on old grievances, but on the honest acknowledgement of a wrong finally, properly addressed. Grace stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down into the same ballroom where 300 strangers had once fallen silent at the sight of her, and felt none of the fear that had gripped her the first time she stood in this exact place. She was wearing white. Not a landlady's borrowed dress this time, ill-fitting and accidental, but a gown chosen deliberately, carefully, over the course of an entire afternoon spent with a dressmaker, who had listened patiently while Grace described exactly what she wanted the moment to feel like. She descended the staircase slowly, aware of every eye in the room turning toward her exactly as they had before, the whispers rising exactly as they had before, but this time she did not feel the ground tilting beneath her. This time she felt something closer to arriving exactly where she meant to be. Alexander crossed the floor to meet her at the bottom of the stairs, just as he had the very first night, except this time there was no confusion in his eyes, no desperate scramble to protect her from a mistake neither of them had made on purpose. "You're wearing white," he said, echoing the words he had spoken to her 7 weeks earlier, though his voice now carried none of the fear it had held then. "I know exactly what it means this time," Grace said. The room around them had gone quiet again, the same held-breath silence as before, but underneath it now ran a current of something warmer, gentler. 300 guests, who had spent 7 weeks watching a strange accident, slowly, carefully, become something true. Alexander reached into his jacket and drew out a small velvet box, and the silence in the room deepened further still, sharpening into the particular quiet of witnesses who understand, all at once, that they are about to see something they will talk about for years. "I once told you," Alexander said, loud enough now for the room to hear, "that in this family, a woman does not wear white to this ball unless she means to accept a proposal that has not yet been spoken aloud. 7 weeks ago you wore that white by mistake, and it very nearly frightened you away from this house, and from me, forever. Tonight you chose it, so I am no longer going to let the tradition speak for me." He opened the box. "Grace Elliot, will you marry me?" The old dowager, standing near the edge of the crowd, pressed one hand briefly to her mouth, her sharp, assessing eyes suddenly and unmistakably bright, with tears she would later deny entirely. Grace looked down at the ring, then up at the man who had crossed a crowded room 7 weeks earlier to protect a stranger from ridicule, who had lied to 300 guests to shield her, who had chosen, again and again, in the middle of danger and suspicion and a family fortune hanging in the balance, to trust her before he had any real reason to. "Yes," she said. The ballroom erupted, warm and genuine this time, applause rolling through the crowd like a wave finally allowed to break, and somewhere in the middle of it, Grace felt Alexander's hand close gently around hers, steady, certain, nothing at all like the frightened grip of a stranger dragging her away from a mistake. This time, it felt like exactly what it was. A beginning, chosen freely, by two people who had first found each other entirely by accident, and had spent 7 weeks, through danger and doubt and a truth neither of them expected to survive, deciding deliberately, together, to stay.